The October sea breeze carried a faint trace of salt as it slipped through the narrow gaps of the old White House at the end of the gravel road. The house had stood there for nearly half a century, quiet and watchful, facing the restless tides of a small coastal town in New England. Margaret stood alone in the kitchen, holding a worn dishcloth in her hands, her gaze drifting toward the window where the ocean stretched out like a sheet of dull silver. She let out a soft sigh, barely audible, as though she feared disturbing the stillness of the afternoon. 40 years. In just 3 days, she and Thomas would celebrate their 40th wedding anniversary. 40 years was a number that suggested permanence, a kind of quiet certainty that life had settled into its final shape, like the predictable rhythm of the waves outside. And yet, it was also long enough for buried things to rise again, unexpected and unforgiving. Margaret placed the cloth on the counter, wiped her hands on her apron, and turned toward the basement door. She had been putting this off for months. Perhaps because she knew that the boxes down there did not only hold old belongings, but pieces of a past she had never truly examined. The wooden steps creaked beneath her weight, each sound echoing softly in the confined space. A dim yellow bulb flickered overhead, casting uneven shadows along the stone walls. The smell of dampness wrapped around her, familiar and cold, like an embrace from another time. Margaret paused at the bottom of the stairs, her hand resting lightly on the railing. A strange unease settled in her chest. She couldn't explain it. Perhaps it was nothing more than age, she told herself. Or perhaps it was the quiet pressure of the coming celebration, stirring thoughts she had long ignored. She began at the far corner, where cardboard boxes were stacked neatly, each labeled in her careful handwriting. Christmas 1992. David's toys. Family photos. Margaret opened them one by one, gently, as if turning the pages of an old book. Faded photographs, plastic toys, greeting cards, each item carried a memory, fragments of a life that once felt simpler, clearer. She smiled faintly at a photograph of Thomas lifting young David onto his shoulders, both of them laughing under the bright summer sun. Thomas, the man she had loved for 40 years, the man everyone in town regarded as the model husband. A man who never forgot anniversaries, never raised his voice, always showed up when his family needed him, perfect, almost too perfect. Margaret shook her head slightly, as if to dismiss the thought before it could take shape. She placed the photo back in the box and moved on to another, tucked deeper into the shadows. This one was smaller. A dark wooden box. No label. Her brow furrowed. She didn't remember seeing it before. Margaret crouched down and brushed away the thick layer of dust that covered the lid. The dust lifted into the air, making her cough softly. She hesitated for a brief moment, then opened it. Inside, there wasn't much. A few loose papers. An old handkerchief, and a yellowed envelope. No stamp. No postmark, and most telling of all, it had never been sent. Margaret picked it up slowly. Her heartbeat shifted, heavier now, more deliberate. On the front of the envelope was a name written in a familiar hand. So familiar, it sent a chill through her. Thomas's handwriting. To Margaret. She stood still for a long moment, unable to move. A cold sensation crept down her spine, though the temperature hadn't changed. A letter, written to her, but never given. Why? Margaret swallowed, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened the envelope. The paper inside was aged, its edges worn, as if it had been waiting there for decades. She drew in a slow breath, and began to read. Margaret, if you are reading this, it means I never found the courage to tell you the truth myself. Margaret froze, her heart tightened. A quiet, creeping dread began to take hold. She continued. I have wanted to tell you for years, but every time I look at you, I cannot. You deserve a better man, someone who does not carry the kind of secrets I do. Margaret shook her head faintly, as if trying to deny what her eyes were seeing. No, that couldn't be right. Thomas wasn't that kind of man. She kept reading. In 1985, before we moved to this town, something happened. Something I have buried for a very long time. Her mind began to spin. 1985, the year they left Boston. The year Thomas said he wanted a quieter life, away from the noise, away from everything. She had believed him. She had always believed him. I am not the man you think I am. And if you knew the truth, you might never look at me the same way again. The paper trembled in her hands. Margaret reached out, steadying herself against the edge of a nearby table. Part of her wanted to stop. To fold the letter, put it back, and pretend she had never found it, but something stronger, something unyielding, forced her to continue. That night, I was there. And what happened afterward, it was not an accident, no matter what people believed. Margaret inhaled sharply. A distant memory flickered at the edge of her mind. A story. An accident, something she had heard about, long ago, but never connected to Thomas. No, it couldn't be. She read on, each word cutting deeper. I stayed silent. I let someone else take the blame for what I had done. And I have lived with that choice every single day since. The letter slipped from her fingers. It drifted to the floor like a dry leaf. The space around her seemed to close in. Even the sound of the distant ocean had faded into nothing. Only silence remained. A terrible, suffocating silence. Margaret stared at the letter on the ground, as though it were something foreign, something that did not belong in her world. Thomas, her husband, the man she had spent 40 years with, the man she trusted more than anyone, could not have written those words, and yet, he had. Margaret bent down slowly, picking up the letter once more, her hands still unsteady. She hadn't finished reading, and she knew, whatever came next might shatter everything she had ever believed to be true. But she could not stop now. There was no turning back. She lowered herself into an old wooden chair in the corner of the basement. The dim light revealed every line time had etched into her face. Margaret closed her eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again. Margaret did not remember how long she sat there in the basement. Time seemed to loosen its grip, stretching into something shapeless and unreal. The letter rested in her lap, its fragile paper now heavier than anything she had ever held. She finished it, every word. Every confession, every silence between the lines that spoke louder than the truth itself. By the time she folded it back along its original creases, her hands were no longer trembling. Not because she felt calm, but because something inside her had gone still, too still. She rose slowly from the chair, the faint creak of wood breaking the silence, and climbed the stairs back into the kitchen. The late afternoon light had shifted. The ocean outside was darker now, restless. The wind pressed harder against the windows, as if something unseen had changed. Margaret placed the letter on the kitchen table. She stared at it, then she covered it with her hand, as though afraid it might disappear, or worse, as though afraid it might still be there. A car door slammed outside. She flinched. Thomas, right on time. Of course, he was always on time. Margaret straightened slightly, instinctively smoothing her apron, as if preparing for something ordinary. Something routine. But nothing about this moment was ordinary anymore. The front door opened. I'm home, Thomas called out, his voice steady, familiar, unchanged. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. For 40 years, that voice had meant safety, and now it carried something else. Kitchen, she replied, her tone even, controlled. Footsteps followed. Slow. Measured. The sound of a man who believed he understood the life he was walking into. Thomas appeared in the doorway, shrugging off his coat. His hair, now more gray than brown, was neatly combed as always. His face carried that same gentle composure that had comforted her for decades. "Smells good in here," he said lightly, though nothing was cooking. Margaret didn't respond. His eyes shifted to the table. To the letter. Something changed. It was subtle. Almost invisible, but Margaret saw it. A flicker, gone in less than a second, but real. Thomas stepped closer. "What's that?" Margaret looked at him then, fully, and not as a wife, not as someone who had shared a life with him, but as someone seeing him for the first time. "I found it," she said quietly. A pause. Thomas didn't ask where. He didn't need to. His gaze remained fixed on the envelope, as though it had been waiting for him all along. "I was wondering when you might," he said. Margaret felt something twist inside her chest, not surprise, not denial, something colder. "You were wondering?" she repeated. Thomas exhaled slowly, setting his coat over the back of a chair. "I never threw it away. I suppose part of me thought you deserved to know." "And the other part?" Margaret asked, her voice sharper now. Thomas met her eyes. "The other part hoped you never would." Silence settled between them, heavy, unforgiving. Margaret picked up the letter, holding it between her fingers. "You let someone else take the blame." Thomas didn't respond immediately. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, as though this were just another evening, another conversation over dinner. "Yes," he said at last, "just that. No explanation. No apology." Margaret let out a quiet, incredulous breath. "That's it? That's all you have to say?" Thomas leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together. "What would you like me to say, Margaret?" "The truth," she snapped. "You've read it. I want to hear you say it." Thomas studied her for a moment. Then he nodded, almost to himself. "It wasn't an accident," he said. "I was there. I made a choice. And someone else paid for it." Margaret felt the words land, one by one, like stones. "Who?" she asked. Thomas hesitated. That hesitation told her more than anything else. "Thomas." He looked down briefly, then back up. "Daniel Harper." The name hit her harder than she expected. Margaret frowned. "Daniel Harper." It took only a second. Her eyes widened. "The boy from Boston," she whispered. "The one who went to prison?" Thomas said nothing, but he didn't need to. "Oh my God," Margaret breathed, stepping back slightly. He was barely 20. "He was in the wrong place," Thomas said quietly. "No," Margaret shot back. "You were." Another silence, this one sharper, more dangerous. Margaret turned away, pressing her hands against the edge of the counter, trying to steady herself. "I stood by you," she said, her voice trembling now. "I built a life with you. I raised a family with you. And all this time," she couldn't finish. Thomas stood up slowly. "I know." Margaret laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "Do you?" She turned back to face him. Do you know what it means to live 40 years with someone you thought you understood? She asked. To trust them completely, only to find out it was all built on a lie? It wasn't all a lie, Thomas said firmly. Margaret's expression hardened. No, she said. Which part was real, Thomas? He stepped closer, his voice low but steady. Everything we built. Our home. Our children. The life we share. That's real. And the man I married? Margaret asked. Was he real? Thomas didn't answer. That was answer enough. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the background, each second stretching the distance between them. Finally, Margaret spoke again. They're coming tonight, she said. Thomas blinked slightly. Who? Our children, she replied. David and Ellen. They wanted to discuss the anniversary plans. Thomas nodded slowly. Right. Margaret picked up the letter again, folding it carefully. We're not done with this, she said. I know. She met his gaze, her eyes no longer soft, no longer uncertain. When they arrive, she continued, you're going to tell them. Thomas's expression shifted, just slightly. That may not be necessary. It is, Margaret said, cutting him off. I won't sit at that table, smiling, pretending, not anymore. They don't need to carry this, Thomas argued quietly. Margaret stepped closer. I've been carrying it for 40 years without even knowing it, she said. Now they get the truth. The front door opened again. Voices. Laughter. Familiar. Warm. So painfully normal. Mom? David's voice called out. We're here. Margaret didn't look away from Thomas. This is your moment, she said softly. The one you never had the courage to face. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. Footsteps approached. The illusion of their perfect life was about to crack. The sound of footsteps filled the hallway, light at first, then closer, more distinct. Mom? David's voice carried a familiar warmth, the kind that once made everything feel safe. You in the kitchen? Margaret did not answer immediately. Her eyes were still locked on Thomas. He hadn't moved. For a moment, she wondered if he ever truly had, or if the man she had lived with for 40 years had always been standing exactly where he was now, silent, composed, and hiding something far deeper than she had ever imagined. Yes, she finally called out. Her voice was steady, too steady. David entered first, tall, broad-shouldered, carrying the ease of someone who believed in the solidity of his world. Ellen followed close behind, her arms full of folders and a bright, distracted energy trailing her steps. There you are, Ellen said, smiling. We've been talking about the anniversary. She stopped. Something in the room shifted. It wasn't obvious. There was no raised voice, no dramatic gesture, but the air felt wrong. David glanced between his parents. Everything okay? Margaret forced a small smile. Sit down, she said gently. Both of you. They exchanged a quick look, then obeyed. Thomas pulled out a chair slowly, but did not sit. He remained standing at the head of the table, his posture straight, his expression carefully controlled. Margaret noticed that. Of course she did. He was preparing. David leaned back slightly, trying to read the situation. All right, this feels serious. Ellen gave a small, uneasy laugh. You're starting to worry me, Mom. Margaret took a breath, then another. She picked up the folded letter from the table and held it in her hands, turning it slightly as though weighing its existence. This afternoon, she began, I was cleaning the basement. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. Margaret saw it, but she continued. I found something. Something your father wrote, a long time ago. David frowned. A letter? Margaret nodded. Ellen leaned forward. What kind of letter? Margaret looked at Thomas. This is where he speaks, she said as silence fell instantly heavy. David turned to his father, confusion tightening his features. Dad? Thomas exhaled slowly, the kind of breath a man takes when he knows there is no longer a way out. He pulled out the chair and finally sat down across from his children, across from everything he had built. There's something I should have told you a long time ago, he said. Ellen's smile faded completely. David straightened, his expression sharpening. Okay, Thomas rested his hands on the table, fingers interlocked. In 1985, he began, before we moved here, there was an incident. Margaret watched her children carefully. She saw the shift, curiosity, turning into concern. It was reported as an accident, Thomas continued. A young man was arrested. Convicted. David nodded slowly. I think I remember hearing something about that, a long time ago. Ellen frowned. What does that have to do with us? Thomas looked up. Everything in the room seemed to narrow to that moment. It has everything to do with us, he said quietly. Margaret felt her heart beat harder, but her face remained still. She had already crossed the threshold. There was no going back. The man who was convicted, Thomas continued, his name was Daniel Harper. Ellen's eyes flickered with recognition. Wait, that was big, wasn't it? There were questions about the evidence. He didn't do it, Thomas said. The words dropped into the room like glass shattering. David blinked. What? He didn't do it, Thomas repeated. Silence. Then who did? David asked, his voice low, cautious. Thomas didn't answer right away. Margaret felt the tension stretch, tighten, threaten to snap. Dad, Ellen said, her voice trembling now. Who did it? Thomas looked at them. At his children. At the life he had protected with silence for 4 decades, then he said it. I did. The room froze. David let out a short, disbelieving laugh. No. No, that's not, what do you mean? Ellen shook her head, already backing away from the table. This isn't funny. I'm not joking, Thomas said. Margaret watched the impact land, and not all at once, but in waves. David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You're telling me you let someone else go to prison for something you did? Thomas didn't flinch. Yes. Ellen's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God, no, David said, pacing now. No, there has to be more to this. There has to be some explanation. There is, Thomas said. But it doesn't change what happened. Then explain it. David snapped. Thomas's jaw tightened. It was late, he said. There was an argument. Things escalated. I made a decision, and I panicked afterward. And you just, what? David's voice rose. Walked away? I stayed quiet, Thomas said. You stayed quiet, David repeated, disbelief turning into anger. For 40 years? Margaret closed her eyes briefly. There it was, the fracture, the soundless, irreversible crack running through everything they had ever been. Ellen shook her head, tears forming now. Do you even understand what you're saying? Yes, Thomas said. Do you? She shot back. Because it sounds like you destroyed someone's life and then came here and just started over like nothing happened. That's exactly what I did, Thomas said. The honesty of it made the room feel smaller, harsher. David stopped pacing. He stared at his father. I don't know who you are, he said quietly. Margaret felt those words like an echo inside her own chest. Thomas didn't respond, because there was nothing left to say. Ellen sank into her chair, her hands shaking. Does anyone else know? Margaret answered this time. No, she said. Only me. Until now. David turned to her, his expression breaking. Mom, how long have you known? Margaret met his gaze. Since this afternoon. And you're just telling us like this? He asked. Margaret held the letter tightly. I'm telling you the truth, she said. Something this family should have had a long time ago. Silence fell again, but this time, it wasn't empty. It was full of anger. Of disbelief. Of something none of them could yet name. Outside, the wind howled louder against the house, rattling the windows as if the storm had finally arrived. Inside, nothing felt stable anymore. Not the walls, not the memories, not even the people sitting at the table. Margaret looked at each of them, her husband, her children, her life, all of it, standing on the edge of something irreversible, and deep down, she knew the hardest decision had not yet been made. The house no longer felt like home. It felt like a place holding its breath. No one moved for several seconds after the last word was spoken. The ticking clock on the wall grew louder, almost intrusive, as if time itself refused to ignore what had just been revealed. David was the first to break. This isn't over, he said, his voice tight, controlled, but barely. Margaret looked at him. No, she replied softly. It's not. Ellen wiped her eyes, her hands still unsteady. What happens now? She asked, her voice fragile, as though even the question might shatter something further. No one answered immediately, because they all knew there was only one real answer. And none of them wanted to say it out loud. David turned back to Thomas, anger returning to his face in sharp lines. You need to go to the police. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Margaret felt something tighten deep in her chest. Thomas did not react the way she expected. He didn't argue. He didn't deny. He simply nodded once. I know, he said. That calm acceptance unsettled her more than any resistance could have. Ellen shook her head quickly. No, wait, it's not that simple. This was 40 years ago. There has to be legal complications, evidence, statutes. A man lost 40 years of his life, David cut in. That's the only part that matters. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. 40 years, the same number, the same span of time she had spent loving Thomas, the same span of time someone else had spent paying for his crime. The symmetry of it made her feel sick. Thomas finally spoke again, his voice quieter now. I've thought about this, more times than I can count, he said. Turning myself in. Writing another letter. Telling the truth. Margaret's eyes snapped open. Another letter, she repeated. Thomas nodded faintly. I wrote more than one. I never sent any of them. Of course you didn't, David muttered bitterly. Thomas didn't respond to that. I convinced myself it was too late, he continued. That it wouldn't change anything. That it would only destroy everything we had built. Margaret stepped closer, her voice low but firm. And now, she asked. Thomas looked at her. Something in his eyes had changed, not the calm she was used to, not the quiet certainty, something heavier. I think it was always going to come to this, he said. Ellen let out a soft, shaky breath. So what, you just walk into a police station and confess? After all this time? If that's what it takes, Thomas said. David nodded sharply. It is. Margaret felt the room tilt slightly, as though the ground beneath them had shifted. She reached out, steadying herself against the back of a chair. This isn't just about him, she said suddenly. They all looked at her. Margaret's voice grew stronger. This affects all of us. Our name. Our lives. Everything. David frowned. Mom, no, she said, cutting him off. Don't reduce this to something simple. It isn't. Ellen nodded faintly, tears still in her eyes. She's right, this changes everything. It already has, David said. Margaret turned to Thomas. For 40 years, she said, you made a choice. Every single day, you chose silence. Thomas didn't look away. Yes. And now, she continued, you want to choose truth. Yes. Margaret studied him, really studied him. As if trying to find the man she thought she knew inside the one standing before her now. And you expect that to fix things? She asked quietly. No, Thomas said. I don't. The honesty of it landed harder than anything else. Margaret felt her throat tighten. Then why? She whispered. Thomas hesitated. For the first time that night, he seemed unsure. Because it's the only thing left I can do that isn't a lie, he said. As silence followed, not sharp this time, not explosive, just heavy. Margaret turned away, walking slowly toward the window. Outside, the ocean had grown darker, the waves crashing harder against the shore. A storm was coming, she could feel it, not just outside, inside. Behind her, she heard David's voice again. We should call someone, he said. A lawyer, maybe. Or, I don't know, but we need to act. Ellen nodded weakly. Yes, we should think this through. Margaret let their voices fade into the background. Her reflection in the glass stared back at her, older, tired, changed. She thought about the life she had lived. The years, the memories of the quiet mornings, the laughter, the small routines that had once felt so certain. Were they all lies? Or were they real, even if built on something broken? Mom? Ellen's voice pulled her back. Margaret turned slowly. All three of them were watching her now, waiting. As if, somehow, the final decision belonged to her, and perhaps it did. Margaret took a step forward, then another, until she stood at the head of the table across from Thomas. I need to ask you something, she said. Thomas nodded. Anything. Margaret held his gaze. That night, she said carefully, was it intentional? The question cut deeper than all the others. Even David froze, even Ellen stopped breathing. Thomas didn't answer immediately, and in that hesitation, Margaret felt the ground shift again. Finally, he spoke. "No," he said. "It wasn't supposed to happen that way." Margaret's eyes didn't soften. "That's not what I asked." Thomas's jaw tightened. He understood. "Yes or no," Margaret said. The room held its breath. Thomas closed his eyes, just for a second, then opened them. "Yes," he said. The word fell like a final verdict. Ellen broke down completely, covering her face as she sobbed. David turned away, his hands clenched into fists. Margaret didn't move. Something inside her settled, and not peace, not forgiveness, but clarity. She picked up the letter from the table, folded it carefully, then placed it in front of Thomas. "Tomorrow morning," she said, her voice steady, unwavering, "you're going to tell the truth." Thomas nodded. "Yes." Margaret took a slow breath. "And tonight," she continued, her eyes no longer trembling, "we sit together. One last time. As a family." No one argued. No one spoke, because they all understood what that meant. Not reconciliation, not healing, but an ending. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Inside, 4 people sat at the same table, separated now by something that could never be undone. Margaret looked at Thomas one last time, the man she had loved, the man she no longer recognized, and somewhere deep within her, a quiet realization took hold. Tomorrow would not just change his life, it would change hers forever. Morning came without mercy. The storm that had threatened through the night never fully broke, but the sky remained heavy, thick with low gray clouds pressing down on the quiet coastal town. Margaret stood by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She hadn't slept. Not really. The night had passed in fragments, memories, questions, silences that refused to fade behind her. The house felt unfamiliar, not empty, just altered. Thomas was gone. That he had left just after sunrise, without ceremony, without hesitation. He had stood in the doorway for a moment, as if searching for something to say, but there had been nothing left. Margaret hadn't stopped him, she hadn't followed, she had simply watched as the man she had spent 40 years with walked out of the house, carrying the weight he had avoided for a lifetime. The front door had closed softly, and that was at point 40 years, ending not with a collapse, but with a quiet, irreversible step forward. Margaret exhaled slowly. Outside, the ocean stretched endlessly, its surface restless, mirroring something she could not yet name within herself. Footsteps sounded behind her. "Ellen." "Any news?" her daughter asked gently. Margaret shook her head. "Not yet." Ellen nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. "David's on the phone. He's trying to find out what happens next, legally." Margaret didn't respond right away. Instead, she set the cup down and turned. Ellen looked smaller this morning, not physically, but something in her certainty had cracked. They all had. "Mom." Ellen hesitated. "Are we still doing tonight?" Margaret held her gaze. Tonight, the anniversary point, 40 years. A celebration that had been planned for months. Guests invited. A small gathering by the water. Friends. Neighbors. A life on display. Margaret thought about canceling. It would be easy, understandable, expected, but something in her resisted that. "Yes," she said finally. Ellen blinked. "Yes?" Margaret nodded. "We're still doing it." Ellen looked uncertain. "But how?" Margaret's voice was calm. Because it's not just about him, she said. It's about the life I lived. And I won't erase that. Ellen didn't fully understand, but she didn't argue. By evening, the sky had cleared just enough to reveal a fading line of gold along the horizon. The wind had softened, leaving behind a quiet, uneasy calm. The small gathering had begun. Soft lights were strung along the edge of the yard, overlooking the ocean. A table had been set, simple but elegant. People spoke in low voices, laughter drifting occasionally into the air. Unaware of the fracture beneath the surface, Margaret stood among them, composed, graceful, alone. Questions had already begun. Where's Thomas? Running late? Still the same punctual man, isn't he? Margaret smiled politely. He won't be joining us tonight, she said, and nothing more. No explanations, not yet. David stayed close, watching the guests, answering where he could, deflecting when he had to. Ellen moved more quietly, her usual brightness dimmed but not gone. The sun dipped lower, the moment approached. Margaret stepped forward, lifting a glass gently. The soft clink drew attention. Conversations faded, all eyes turned to her. For a brief second, she felt it, the weight of 40 years, the memories, the illusion, the truth. She took a breath. I want to thank all of you for being here tonight, she began, her voice steady, carrying across the quiet space. This was meant to be a celebration of 40 years of marriage. A pause. Margaret felt the silence deepen. And in many ways, she continued, it still is. A few guests exchanged glances, confused, curious. Margaret didn't look away. 40 years is not a small thing, she said. It is made of countless moments, joy, struggle, love, compromise. It is not perfect. It never is. Her voice softened slightly. But it is real. David lowered his gaze. Ellen stood very still. Margaret continued. Today, I learned something that changed my understanding of those 40 years. A ripple moved through the crowd, subtle but unmistakable. Margaret held her ground. My husband will not be joining us tonight, she said. Because he is finally telling a truth he should have told a long time ago. Silence fell completely now. No movement. No whispers, just the sound of the ocean in the distance. Margaret felt her heartbeat, but it did not shake her. For many years, I believed I knew the man I married, she said. And perhaps, in some ways, I did. She paused. But people are more complicated than we allow ourselves to see. A long breath. I am not here tonight to defend him, she said. And I am not here to erase what has been done. Her grip tightened slightly around the glass. I am here to say this: truth matters. Even when it comes late. Even when it breaks everything we thought was whole. No one spoke. No one dared. Margaret's voice grew quieter. But so does the life we lived. And I will not pretend those years didn't exist. She lowered the glass slightly. I choose to remember what was real, and to face what was not. A final pause, then, that is my celebration. Silence, then, slowly, someone nodded, then another, not applause, not approval, but understanding. Margaret lowered the glass completely. The moment passed, people began to breathe again. To move. To speak, softly, respectfully. The night continued, but differently now, more honest, less certain. Margaret stepped away from the gathering, moving toward the edge of the yard where the land met the sea. The waves rolled in, Steady and endless, she stood there, alone again, but not the same. Behind her, voices continued, life continued ahead of her, the ocean stretched into darkness. Margaret took a slow breath. 40 years had shaped her, but they did not define what came next. Somewhere, far away, a future waited, uncertain, unwritten, but finally, true.